You're listening to the We Are Libertarians Podcast Network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com. Welcome to the Chris Spangle Show. My name is Chris Spangle. Thank you so much for joining me. I am excited to bring a guest to you today that I have followed for 15 years maybe. Max Borders. I don't know how to describe his career. You know, he's somebody that I've followed since he started a conference called Voice and Exit, which was about voicing your displeasure with the way things are working and checking out of the system. You know, he is an author of several books. Probably the biggest is The Social Singularity. He's written The Decentralist, After Collapse, and he's got a new book called Underthrow. And I love this book because it basically takes the spirit of the founders, specifically Thomas Jefferson, and applies them to the era of technological advancement that we live in. You know, people will often talk about, well, how do the words of these dead founders who lived when it was horse and carriages and mail took 3 weeks to get to somebody in another state, what lessons do they have for us in the modern age? And the book Underthrow really talks about the application of Jefferson's philosophy to the modern age and how people ought to be, specifically the phrase consent of the governed, and how we ought to build a new constitution around consent of the governed. And he's putting his money where his mouth is. He has a contest for $25,000 to write a brand new $25,000 to write a brand new constitution based around the consent of the governed and adapting the U.S. Constitution to the modern age. So check it out. Max Borders is an incredibly fascinating guy. I really enjoyed our conversation. So let's get to it right after these words.
You know what's smart? Enjoying a fresh gourmet meal at home that you didn't have to cook. Meet Factor, your loophole in the laws of mealtime. Chef-crafted meals delivered with a tap, ready in just 2 minutes. You know what's even smarter? Treating yourself without cheating your goals. Factor is dietitian approved, chef prepared, and you plated. Pretty smart, huh? Refresh your routine and eat smart with Factor. Learn more at factormeals.com.
Max Borders, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
You know, I have followed your career. You know, one of my nerdy things that I like to do, back when I worked for the Advocates for Self-Government, I started doing this, even actually at the Libertarian Party of Indiana back in 2010, is collecting lists of libertarian podcasts and libertarian websites and think tanks. And, you know, I just was looking at libertyexplained.com at that list, which are now woefully outdated because I've stopped following the libertarian movement in a lot of ways. You know, but during that time, I came across your work. I think it was really Voice and Exit, which I guess you'd call a decentralization TED Talk. You can quibble with that if you'd like, but I thought that was such a cool idea. And one thing that I've loved about your career that has been instructive for me is that you seem to have focused, people like me who come from a political background focus a lot on politics. There are a lot of people who kind of focus on philosophy, right? You always have...
Guilty.
Yeah, you definitely are in that vein. You know, like listening to your interview with Andrew Heaton and just reading the book, you definitely seem like a decentralization Madison. How can we... You're a nerd for different governing types, and it was fun listening to you two to talk about, well, you know, the Native Americans started and they had this. But you really seem to... I don't know. How would you describe your interest? Decentralization seems to be very important, but you always have seemed to try to project towards the future of here's where we want to go. And I think one of the problems with a lot of libertarian or right-leaning thinkers is we're thinking about the problems of the present based on our understanding of the past. So your tone and tact and focus, I think, has been really cool. So where did that develop? First, quibble with anything that I just said, but from an outside perspective, that's sort of how I've always viewed what Max Borders does. Where can we get to? Which I think is really cool.
First of all, no quibbles, none at all. I am old enough. You can see in the salt in my hair that I'm old enough to have come from a politics, policy, and punditry background. Actually, I'm a trained philosopher, so the philosophy bit was dead on. And I'm still a sucker for that. I always will be. It's woven into the fabric of my being. But I think the politics, policy, and punditry thing, I did that for a long time. I worked in a number of organizations on those topics, and they tend to sort of constrain people's thinking. And the way I hoped to sort of reframe things with some of the projects I've worked on over the years is to get people interested in creativity, entrepreneurship, and innovation as a mechanism of social change. And I actually think that people of a libertarian sensibility are much better suited to that than traditional politics. Not only because they tend to be have engineers' brains, left-brained kind of folks, and that's not wholesale, but that is like the great preponderance of people in who self-identify that way, I would say are much better suited to entrepreneurship and innovation than
processes versus art.
Well, and that's unfortunate too. I think we need to be able to have more creatives, more creative types who are right brain thinkers. But yeah, they're more interested in process. They're more interested in analysis, and that only goes so far in policy analysis. But a lot of times, I think what you get are people who have interesting ideas and innovations that push back against both the prevailing narratives and the status quo in interesting ways. And while I definitely appreciate certain things about conservatism as a doctrine, that is, you don't want to change too many things too rapidly. You don't want to tear down Chesterton's fence. There's some, it's like you have to acknowledge progressive, conservative. You have to acknowledge the beauty and the interesting facets of all of the different political movements. My hope is, and I believe as a liberal, and I just call myself a liberal, sort of broadly speaking, with, I have deep libertarian sympathies, but broadly speaking, I think what liberalism brings to the table is this idea that we are trying to liberate you to experiment with different conceptions of the good that would involve self-selecting into specific kinds of communities. And those communities can look very different from one to the next. But as each individual explores their communities, they find which ones comport with their particular conceptions of the good. And that's just a fancy way of saying we're all different. And some of us are wired differently. Some of us come into the world differently. And acknowledging that pluralism among people means maybe we're kind of trapped in a system where we're trying to figure out what the one true way is and bludgeon everybody with it. And even libertarians can fall under that way of thinking sometimes. So what I try to do is say, look, decentralization is a way of instantiating pluralism. It is a way for us to try out different ways of life, more highly local settings. Stop fixating so much on these distant capitals and the spectacles of electoral politics, or trying to oblige someone in a bureaucracy to do something interesting and new that is going to run afoul of some special interest group. And instead, let's start creating things that people can join in and make change that way. And of course, I started having that reinforced for me really heavily reinforced to me on about 2012 and 2013. And that's when Uber came out. Uber came out in 2012. And the Bitcoin white paper was written in, I think, 2009. And I had been exposed to the ideas of Bitcoin in 2011. So the long and short of it is, it's like, whoa, Bitcoin and Uber and these different entrepreneurial projects, innovation projects, were a way that you could move the needle that circumvented the box of politics, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you scratch a lot of the itches that I'm kind of thinking through and wading into. I've always been a very political person and not as much a philosophical person. So over the last year or two, I've really been trying to like catch up and I was like, what is a liberal? What is a conservative? And what are the histories of these terms? And, I've kind of been thinking through some of that stuff, and I've made it up to the American Revolution lately. So the title of your book is Underthrow, How Jefferson's Dangerous Ideal Will Spark a New Revolution. And man, you just have written a book that I've been looking for, because one of the currents, I think a lot of it may come from libertarians, kind of maybe more coming from a conservative background. Ron Paul, I think, has a lot to do with that. You are a libertarian, you call yourself a liberal, but in the libertarian vein, like I call myself a libertarian from the before times, right? Where people who were libertarians before Donald Trump have, I guess, a different sort of view of things than maybe post-Trump libertarians. The more populist veins seem to have a lot more distrust in their fellow man than they may be a little more John Adams than the Jeffersonian libertarians, where, look, it's the consent of the governed, and yes, we should be skeptical of democracy, but decentralization is key. I've always believed that that decentralization is the future. You talk a lot about pluralism, the idea that different cultures can and will live together and exist in proximity, in online spaces, in different places, and you cannot eradicate that. I think that there are some folks who have not figured that out. We talk a lot about the culture wars, so this is the first question. I've got a lot of questions out of some of that thinking there. The first question is the culture wars and how you sort of interpret the culture wars. And, I'm sort of like, I'm a Christian conservative leaning person who is deeply committed to liberalism and pluralism and democracy and capitalism and kind of the direction that you're moving with decentralization. And that it's not going to be all that horrifying if we can just kind of break out of some of these propaganda models that we're under. How do you interpret it? Do you look at it and just sort of go, well, I'm just checking out of this and let's focus on other things? Or do you say, one side will inevitably win, so we ought to participate? How do you look at the culture wars and these two sides that just keep bludgeoning each other in the press?
Let me answer that with a reference to another book I wrote back in 2017, published in 2018, called The Social Singularity. I opened that book with the following metaphor. It's like, what if you woke up one morning to check your smartphone, and most people do that in the morning now because that's the world we live in. You open up your smartphone and you only find that there are two apps, the red app and the blue app. How would you feel about your smartphone at that point? You would feel pretty disappointed because, at least I would, because, and by the way, these two apps fight over which one is going to be, you're going to be able to use for a certain time period for the operating system, right? Which I would call DOS, the Democratic Operating System.
Yeah.
Okay.
Outdated.
Outdated. That's right. So what we're living in now is DOS, the Democratic Operating System. And there are only two apps and there are only two choices. And that duopoly of red versus blue, it creates massive incentives to tribalize around one side or the other. And what that does is it takes away from local experimentation. I I just moved away from Austin to a much more conservative area. I love where I'm living now. It's beautiful and fun. But in living in Austin, it was a really heterodox community. There's all sorts, everything from progressives, hippie types to techies, which you might call the gray-minded, from Balaji Srinivasan, I think, taught me that. To obviously conservatives and Christian conservatives in Austin as well. And that heterodox community, when you really start talking to people and you start talking about their values, the things that they want, you realize that they engage, the way they think about their community locally is a far cry from the way they behave online when talking about the macro picture. This system of incentives it sort of forces us to want to, because we live in a system where the idea is if our team gets elected, we get to install them at the highest echelons of power, and we're going to get to our chosen way gets to be everyone's chosen way, shoved down everyone's throats. Decentralization, which is, I would say the mechanism, the political mechanism for, which is just breaking up power into smaller, more local units so that people can more readily or more easily self-govern. What they instantiate more locally might not be what we're used to. They might be able to experiment with a little welfare state locally when people know their neighbors better. And that welfare state is administered in a way that's much more communitarian than it is now, whereas we just, for example, outsource our sense of responsibility for our fellow man to distant capitals and expect that this largesse is going to be just sort of, distributed from on high as if by algorithm. I mean, that's really what it seems like, faceless bureaucracies, just cutting checks to people. It's almost like a vote buying scheme.
Yeah, versus the township model here in Indiana, where you can go and help. They can help turn on your lights, buy your kids school clothes, but they're going to come out and do an inspection, and they're going to turn down 2/3 of the people because they could sell their TV, right? Versus
or whatever.
What bureaucrat are you trying to convince that just doesn't care because they don't have to?
Right, and I think the more abstracted away people get from their governance, which is the electoral spectacle that happens every 2 or 4 years. Some people don't even do their midterm elections. They just care about the presidential, because that gobbles up all of the real estate, all the media real estate, all of the, the cult of the presidency, and the administration, presidential administration has so much power. The executive branch has so much power now that the deep state is a very real thing. And I don't think anybody can deny that anymore. It used to be, they'd make fun of you if you said the deep state. And today it's sort of like, yeah, that's the reality. Whereas if you had a model that was more like, let's say, Sweden or Liechtenstein, or a city-state like Singapore. Singapore is very conservative in its orientation in terms of social freedoms. They will put you to death if you try to sell someone a certain amount of drugs. I don't like that as a liberal. I find that a little too excessive. But I think, in terms of as a local municipality, if I wanted to opt out of something like that, if you can reduce the cost of my exiting some jurisdiction that doesn't comport with my conception of the good, I can go live in another one that is a little more liberal in that regard. And then I'm not fighting with my neighbors in the next county over what gets to be shoved down everybody's throat at the state level or the national level. So, of course, the founders cottoned onto this very early on with the idea of the 9th and 10th Amendment, building in federalism. I don't think they anticipated to what degree the 9th and 10th Amendments would be defenestrated. Disregarded,
completely ignored, totally unknown, yeah.
That's right. So in trying to find a way to resurrect some sort of subsidiarity rule, which comes out of the Catholic tradition, the idea does, but is basically like, let things be decided at the most local feasible level. You can get as close as possible to anarchy without ever really getting there. Sometimes I call myself jokingly an asymptotic anarchist. Because you have
what?
Asymptotic anarchist. It's a fancy word. So an asymptote, and I'm not a mathematician, by the way, so I'm using this metaphorically. But an asymptote is a curve that approaches a line like an axis and never actually gets there, right? In mathematics, it's the same kind of idea, like Zeno's paradoxes. People constantly, among libertarians particularly, argue over these ideas. We're going to have a minimal state, and it has to do this and that certain kind of thing. Ayn Rand says so, or,
Hans Hermann Hoppe told me that I had to believe this.
Exactly,
right.
Exactly. Hans Hermann Hoppe says it looks like this, and this is what we need to instantiate. Or The anarchists is like, we shouldn't have any government at all because that opens the door to this and that and the other. And I'm like, I agree with the anarchists that political power is fundamentally unjust. Michael Huemer's book, the Problem of Political Authority, is really good in this regard. But we're never going to have a Michael Huemer moment unless we're like coming out of some state of warlordism. But even then, you're going to have a powerful, some sort of force to protect you in a condition to instantiate whatever your utopia is. And so I've been more influenced by, speaking of utopia, this guy, Robert Nozick, who is a philosopher who died in the, 1999, 2000, I think, who had this great book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And he, in the third chapter of this, which is not the most famous chapter, but in the third chapter, he talks about a framework for utopias, or a utopia of utopias. And that little joke, that little thing he's talking about is just basically saying, hey, there ain't no such thing as utopia. We've got to have as many experiments as possible that people can opt into and try out, and leave it if they don't work, or reduce the costs of exiting a jurisdiction that isn't serving their conception of the good. And that has stayed with me for a long time from my philosophy background. And now I'm like, okay, let's try to find creative ways to get people to think along these lines, because if we don't try to shove the one true way down everybody's throats, we don't have to go to war against each other. We don't have to start engaging in this social media civil war that we're already in right now, or electoral politics governs everything.
So wait, you're saying I could just delete my app and not participate in the culture wars?
Oh, in the culture war?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, no. That I forgot that this we started off talking. You had wanted to ask about.
I do think there's an element of like you have no idea how much you're being catechized by what you're seeing every 2 minutes out of 5 on Facebook, and you can just go read Nozick or Hoppe, or
you can't just go read Nozick.
Yeah, it is a little bit of work,
right?
But you can.
So let me go to the question of culture.
Yeah.
Please, I don't want to interrupt the.
No, but I think that's kind of where the thinking is going. It's less about what government to shape under, but how am I going to sort myself in with people that I just there's no ability for me to go to send my kids to school with someone who believes that there should be trans story hour, right? Like that's sort of the prevailing thought of the moment, that we can't have a pluralistic society because the differences are just too irreconcilable, and we need to completely dissolve the union and I don't know, send the liberals to Philadelphia and the conservatives to Indianapolis.
Well, there's a lot of that going on in Canada, but I haven't heard anybody suggest that we invade Canada.
You have not been listening to this show. That's been been a strong theme of this show for 11 years, but no, go ahead. Yeah.
Invade Canada.
Yeah, I'm all for it.
There are a lot of jurisdictions around the world where who participate in what we might call deal breakers, right? Who have policies that are beyond the pale to us. And again, what's beyond the pale to one person might not be beyond the pale to the next. My sense is we've got to, in some sense, protect basic rights. That there has to be some concept of, of an individual right. The Bill of Rights enumerates many of these, but basically that we create a condition where it is illegitimate, and by which I mean illegal, to make someone worse off who is innocent. Okay, that is a pretty basic to liberal doctrine or libertarian doctrine. Now, there might be deal breakers in what are the status of children, what is the status of the unborn, all of these kind of things like this. The status quo on that currently, after the Supreme Court decision, for example, with abortion, is do it states. I would say go even lower in terms of jurisdictions if we're talking about terra firma. So that so that you can carve out more spaces for people who, because I very much understand both sides personally of the abortion debate. I understand both sides, and both sides make very, very important claims, and they indeed seem to be irreconcilable. But short of war over these deal breakers, these irreconcilable issues, maybe even then we want to have a subsidiarity rule and have smaller jurisdictions such that you can avoid civil war. Now, very quickly, I want to go back to the question of culture, because in this conversations, it's like, Max, what you're doing is all very theoretical and abstract, and you're trying to teach people this, what the benefits of civil decentralization would be. In Switzerland, for example, the canton has as much authority as the federal government. So cantons are able to set most of the rules for that particular region in Switzerland. The federal government is more of a confederation. In fact, it used to be called the Swiss Confederacy. It may still be. But there is a balance between unity and diversity in Switzerland that has held together for a long time, and they're generally known as peaceful people. They don't go to war with their neighbors, and they don't go to war with each other. Not really. COVID, there was some problems because they were trying to institute a lot of COVID, vaccine mandates and things like that. And the Swiss like their freedom. They like their neutrality. But as an exemplar, I think Switzerland does a very good job of what the founders of the American Republic were hoping to achieve with the canton system, with federalism in the United States. And as we've already said, the 9th and 10th Amendment has been shredded, gutted, whatever metaphor you like. That, therefore, we need to do something else. And I have a lot of people who are like, well, you're going to have to build culture around this idea. So the way I try to do that is appeal to their patriotism. Go back and read the Declaration of Independence. If you have any patriotism left in you, cultural patriotism, that is beyond just, I like my country and I like this flag, that's not enough. Like there's got to be some intellectual content to the patriotism. And the Declaration of Independence has this really important thing about rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But the very most important part of it was that those rights, if a government does not instantiate those rights, then people have a right to tear down and reconstitute the government. And the consent of the governed is the key piece there. That's why I call the book, the subtitle of the book, Jefferson's Dangerous Idea. That is his dangerous idea, is the idea of opt-in governance, of smaller jurisdictions where you can go into, where you would be legally able to break off from a jurisdiction that isn't working to start with some other jurisdiction, or even perhaps, and this is something that Jefferson might not have been able to imagine, but governance in the cloud, where you can choose from a menu of legal options that exist in the cloud, the digital cloud. Mm-hmm. I'll leave that for the moment.
Do you walk through that in the book, how that would work?
Yeah. So there's a guy, and this predates the third part of Anarchy, State, and Utopia by I don't know, long time, 100 something years. This Belgian guy named Paul-Émile Dupuy, I think is the way you pronounce it. I don't know if that's Belgian or French.
It all flows down.
I don't know if he's Belgian, but I don't know if it's the French influence to the name or the Dutch. But the idea is called panarchy, okay? And the suggestion from Dupuy is this. Imagine you could just opt into, instead of joining the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, you could sign up for their governance services and live by their auspices. Now, you might have a local jurisdiction that dictated stuff about, local schools and traffic lights and parking meters and this and that we all know are in towns. And they may even want to have, some kind of little social welfare system at the most local feasible level. But the idea is with a subsidiary, not just a subsidiarity rule, but that you could choose your governance structure. And you might couple that with a federalism rule. But that you would join, instead of joining a party, that you would try to get that party elected to hold sway over the 350
to essentially
million
from
people.
top down force those values on other people who don't necessarily reflect those values.
That would be illegal.
Down. Right.
That would be illegal under this system, under this kind of constitution. That's exactly right. And so you would, if there are people in the county over who are who are part of an Israeli style kibbutz, they share everything in common. They live in an intentional community. They're all they can live and die by that system, and that's okay. And maybe your conception of the good is plucked in a panarchist system. There are other intentional communities that attach to that superordinate governance structure. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but like it's exactly how we use social media now. And that's promising to me. These tech examples, I keep coming back to these tech examples about your smartphone or whatever, and having options and opting into different kind of systems. You don't have to go to war with your neighbor. You just have to, you'd either have to move or take them to court, because the tweet says, after you've subscribed to your chosen system and live under its laws, it might include a heavy taxes, it might not. But after you opt into your chosen governance system, you then, if there are disputes between and among jurisdictions, that goes to common law courts. And that is, I think, how you resolve some of these things. And then you can create settled law based on the common law.
We have, in the History of Modern Politics podcast that I do with my friend Matt Whitliff, barely dived into common law versus statutory law. We, in America, don't live under the common law. We live under, I don't know what.
We have a hybrid structure. We do live some common law, but statutes are gobbling up everything.
Yeah, right. Where we refer back to case law as opposed to, look, this is just the values of the society. So, how do you envision moving forward? Like, talk to me about Underthrow and how we start to, and the contest. Plug the contest, because I think that certainly plays into this. But like, if you've given the German idea, like we've started with, all right, maybe you could be open to a different idea. Here's the idea that we're suggesting. Now let's get to the hard part, because like with the Constitution, for instance, one thing I love about the book, and one thing I could not agree with you more as I become sort of obsessed with the American Revolution and the idea of it, it was so revolutionary for its time, and Americans have completely lost sight of this, where you didn't have the son of a king who's the son of a king sort of being the, the voice of God, Peter II of Spain saying, don't get these two confused because it's the same thing in the 1500s. Like Pedro, not Peter, excuse me. But you had the founders coming along and saying, we're going to disperse power, decentralize it amongst the states, and let them choose. I don't think there's anything unreasonable about your idea of, let's say, abortion. Why can't a state legislator walk up and say, we're going to let counties in Indiana decide how they apply abortion law? The state government wants to have the authority of that. Now we're talking about Mike Pence and Kamala Harris arguing over the federal government and trying to force those values. So when they sat down to write the Constitution and, revise the Articles of Confederation and determine a scheme for the government and have the arguments like through the Federal and Anti-Federalist Papers, there was a lot of negotiation, right? So slavery always is brought up. Hypocrisy is woven into the fabric of the American Republic, not just slavery, right? The thing about hypocrisy is that you have two ideas that are, one's good and one's bad, right? In Jefferson, the ideas of the natural rights, tradition, and every man is equal, and all the values he expressed, he did not embody them, but it doesn't mean that those values are wrong, right? But when that you are trying to apply those, you couldn't get the Constitution passed without negotiations, but they all acknowledged they had set up a time bomb, right? So the idea of updating the software of governance, how do you move forward when you actually start to have the rubber meet the road in a second founding, or as Glenn Beck there for a while called it, the refounding?
That is a beautiful question. That is, and that is the most daunting aspect of this for me. So first, let me talk about the Constitution of Consent contest, because that was in there a little bit, and then I'll tell you. Then I'll answer the part about the latter part. The Constitution of Consent contest. If your listeners will go to underthrow.org, Underthrow being the name of the book as well. Yeah, it's probably confusing, but underthrow.org. You'll in the nav bar, there's a thing that says contest. That contest, we're offering $25,000, $20,000 first prize, $3,000 second prize, and $2,000 third prize for the team or individual who can come up with the best Constitution of Consent, where consent is riffing on Jefferson's dangerous idea, that of the consent of the governed. All the hardcore libertarians out there who like Lysander Spooner will like the fact that you actually have to sign this Constitution. And I think Jefferson would agree. Jefferson was worried about the sophistry of the General Welfare Clause and others, and so also was the Anti-Federalists who opposed it. In fact, Robert Yates of New York walked out of the Constitutional Convention because he saw that they were going to create an imperial monster. And boy, was he right. It happened.
New York
and that is
didn't sign it, and New York's objections largely were right.
That's right. And the other New Yorker, Hamilton, was the one who ended up winning the day and winning the argument. And he, frankly, was responsible in great measure for ruining the country and giving us the shit show we have today. Excuse my mouth. But Jefferson, and so people might confuse me for saying that I don't venerate the Constitution. I think it was a brilliant, brilliant document. It did something to the world. It created a situation that changed the world in a great many ways to positive effect. I admire it deeply, and I think that there are features of it that must be copied personally. So when I invite people to enter this contest, it's like, how would you improve on the old Constitution? What would you keep? What would you scrap? How would you institute this idea of right of self-determination for a jurisdiction? Right. So if this Northwest, I think it's Washington or Oregon, Northeast Washington or Northeast Oregon wants to break off and join Idaho, they can do that. That's their prerogative. Where those kind of features are built into it, where there's no question about the legality of the right of self-determination. And that individual people can be signatories to this. So at the macro level, it's like, yes, I want to participate in this, and this is my chosen body of law. And of course, it would build in the common law and not privileged statute law. I'm aware of the irony that a constitution is a form of statute, but otherwise, judicial supremacy, you resolve your disputes between and among jurisdictions, between and among people in common law courts. This is the way you have Hayekian bottom-up law, spontaneous order kind of law. So now, how do you get people? This gets to the question about how you get people thinking along these lines or appreciating this, because most people are kind of trapped in kind of status quo thinking.
Geographical boundaries. It's. I'm listening to you going, well, how does that work if I live? How does Ms. Kim and the Mohammeds and Donna next? How do we all have different governments? That just doesn't make sense to me. They live next door to me.
Well, you're going to have different governments, right? You're going to have a local government that's going to have resolve questions on certain things, like maybe parks and roads and drug policy, right? They might have a red light district, but that's it, or they might have completely drug-free zone or something like that, and you're going to have to figure out where in the governance stack that goes. So the idea is you're going to have multiple jurisdictions, but the federal jurisdiction is going to only be responsible for ensuring that no single jurisdiction gets too big and has control over everybody else, so that one true way getting shoved down everybody's throat problem gets solved. Now, here's how it would work. I see what you're asking now. I was interpreting you in a different way, and I'm going to try to answer both ways. Think about right now, you and I see each other on Facebook all the time. I happen to see you all the time. You got a pretty family you're building.
Thank you.
And every once in a while, I'll put pictures of my kids on there. I hope you see those. And we can join Facebook groups, right? We can join all kinds of things just on Facebook. If Facebook we considered our social operating system, there's all manner of things that we can join in or get out of in Facebook. If you use that as a rough metaphor for what I'm describing, you would be able to. There are certain things that are going to have spillover effects for communities. So you might have stronger drug prohibition laws or whatever in a jurisdiction. And you're going to have people fighting in courts over whether and to what extent they can defend themselves for Second Amendment, which some people see as very basic right. But the idea of governance pluralism would be, it seems arbitrary that I can have a say over how people, I'm in South Carolina right now, how you in Indiana ought to have to live, but I don't have any say of how people in Mexico or Canada live, even though I'm closer to Mexico perhaps than you. I don't know that to be the case. When I was in Texas, I definitely was.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. You know it's all sort of phony baloney anyways, the geographic boundaries. So
right.
We already have in the internet age means of governing, I manage a lot of big brands, right? And large Facebook groups, and we have rules that we have set on how we interact with each other and how we're going to do deals. And there's professional ethics, for instance, Hollywood has a totally different set of professional ethics than lawyers do. Have you ever talked to a lawyer? Talking to a lawyer, I had to do it yesterday. Nice guy. He's a phenomenal human being, but they will commit to nothing because of ethics, right? Like they will not give you doctors are the same way, just because ethics, being in the media, I have a certain philosophical approach to how I treat other people or use these platforms, and other people choose different ways, right? But I have my set of ethics, right? So is that sort of what you're saying, where, look, we already have all these instances where we have, in the digital age, created these different sets of ethics in which we govern ourselves. Why not start to implement that? Right.
I know a bunch of people who don't live in Delaware, but incorporate in Delaware. Because they have a body of business law that extends back really far, and it's good quality law. People like Delaware's business law, so they incorporate in Delaware. It's low tax. It's this. It's that. There are, for example, in Estonia has e-residency. You can become a resident of Estonia without actually having to live there, and you incorporate in Estonia and you enjoy their low tax environment. You enjoy their whatever aspects of their legal code they're proud of. And they think that, and if you're living in an African nation where the bureaucracy is thick and the regulations are so strong that it makes it virtually impossible for you to create a business in that jurisdiction, you might want to pluck from a menu of options. Also, there's international law governing business between and among multinational corporations that hold sway all the time. And when you do business with someone, you agree to do an arbitration agreement, right? Where you agree to go to a common arbiter, certain court system.
I think this makes a lot more sense than just anarchy, right? So like anarchists will kind of run around and go, well, there just should be no laws. And that just doesn't work for people because I have to pay somebody to do my trash, and I've got to hire a lawyer. Right. Whereas if you adopt a set of governing codes around, look, we generally agree with the principles of this set of constitutional rules around marriage and business and X, Y, and Z, right? Maybe you can articulate what would be kind of covered under these governing operating systems. It's a much more clean, understandable, acceptable form of governance for people, because just saying there should be no government is just sort of overwhelming, I think, to people.
Yeah, and look, I think one could argue that what I'm after is a species of anarchy. Anarchy, I think, properly construed, is rules without rulers, right? And if you have people who really want to be ruled, or really, really want a certain kind of governance structure that has an administrative hierarchy, that's really hard to argue with. Except till it extends to the entire country, and that's where the costs of escaping that jurisdiction become inordinately high. That's what we're trying to avoid. So yeah, this is sort of like a pragmatic way of looking at anarchy as rules without rulers, because if you can easily move to another jurisdiction or to another body of law after the subscription period elapses, I can choose another body of law. And then if there's any disputes between the jurisdiction, it goes to court. That body of law might live in the cloud as well. Common law does. English common law, you had, the law books were applied anywhere they needed to, if that makes sense. There's a whole great tradition of emergent law called the lex mercatoria, which just means the merchant law. All across the Silk Road, people used this law to do what they needed to do in the Middle Ages, and it was a flourishing centers of activity that allowed people to trade and have commercial relationships, even though they weren't all from the same nation state.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
So instead of someone coming in and imposing a set of COVID restrictions on me, right? You would have a situation where, look, we have this disagreement. What set of laws can we go and access that we can both agree, let's mediate these rules, as opposed to someone coming in heavy-handedly and saying, this is how you're going to do it. And if you don't, I'm going to bankrupt you or jail you. Versus the Silk Road example of like the peasant in the middle of, what is now Germany, had no need necessarily of those laws. They had a different set of needs of laws for how to deal with an oppressive lord who was stealing 50% of what they made. They don't need the Silk Road law. They need a different set of laws. And so let's govern ourselves under these laws based on need as opposed to force.
And you got the Magna Carta. You already had the English common law when you got the Magna Carta. These emergent forms of law have always been with us. It's really the Romans who ruined everything with statute, the Justinian law. And yeah, they had their legislative bodies and their deliberative bodies, the Senate and so on. But it's this idea of sort of statutes holding sway over great swaths of territory to be administered by governors or satraps or whatever, that the influence of Rome persists today. And it's not to say that everything about Rome was bad. It's not. I mean, there were some amazing things the Romans were able to achieve, but they did a lot of it through imperialism and conquest. Even as the Republic, the people underestimate the degree to which the English common law is a superior form of law, in my opinion. Notwithstanding my idea that it should start with a constitution, which is a statute.
Well, one thing, and this is kind of my final.
Actually, no, it's not. In this situation, it's a multilateral contract. And that is the difference. It is something you sign and agree to live to, and that's the difference.
So how would you deal with somebody that you don't agree on what laws, what constitution to adopt, or what set of laws? How would you, deal with that, where I'm living in my landlord's house and look, he just decides? That's sort of always been my hang up on anarchy, right? Like, I agree to use this court and he agrees to use that court, and well, we just can't agree on court, so I'm going to just take your stuff, right? They have more power than I have because they have more capital. I could see that possibly being a breakdown in the system. How would you answer that?
Yeah, I think you're going to start to see all sorts of things that spring up around this in terms of insurance structures and things that, it's like if you get an economist can map this out for us, but basically conflict is costly, right? And a lot of things you might do if we were to a bunch of us were to opt into this Constitution, but others not. It's sort of like disputes that you might have with someone who's from Mexico or someone who's from Canada. That has to be reconciled in some way. International conflicts happen all the time and are reconciled, and they're not reconciled at the UN. They're usually done through arbitration courts.
I think that's a good point. So you have Belarusian agreements where, in the past, Ukraine and Russia or the United States and Russia have had to meet in Belarus and hammer out an agreement through arbitrators. And so, yes, while it would be annoying that you would have to have arbitration, you'd have to have mediation, you'd have a lot less government force in your life. You would just have sort of like divorce, right? Like nobody goes into marriage thinking they're going to get divorced, but when it goes wrong, you have a system for dealing how to, and nobody ever comes out totally happy, but at least it's somewhat fair for some folks. The final thing that I wanted to bring up,
and there are different laws in different states, by the way.
Yeah.
Right. So, with a subsidiarity rule, and I would encourage people who want to enter the Constitution of Consent contest to consider a subsidiarity rule, which is all decisions must be made at the most local feasible level. If an age of consent law, for example, applies, if you're, I don't know what it is, 16 in South Carolina, let's say in North Carolina, it's 17 or 18. I don't know. I just don't know. I'm from North Carolina, but I don't know.
As a libertarian, I feel like that's like where we all, you become libertarian long enough. You're like, well, and then it comes down to AOC.
To AOC?
Age of consent.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So like if I am an 18-year-old with my 16-year-old girlfriend in South Carolina, then I'm okay. But if I get caught in the steamy back of the car with my 16-year-old girlfriend in the state that has a 17-year-old age of consent, I might get arrested for statutory rape. And if the law accrues to that jurisdiction, right, as part of a subsidiarity rule, then I might not have any cover by the Constitution. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
By because the Constitution is going to be restricted at the federal level to very few things, and age of consent laws might not be one of those. Just like legal codes regarding how you can build your house and what you can build, put in your yard. If you're a member of a homeowners association and you live next to someone who's not, and they have yard cars, what is your recourse?
Right.
We have these kind of situations all the time already, and they have to be resolved in courts. Interstate conflicts with different sets of laws and so on. There are interstate conflicts as well because people do business across state lines all the time. Our Constitution does do a little around this, but the long and short of it is there are going to be a lot of ways where you have these secondary markets to ensure that you have protections. And that sounds like a very David Friedman-esque kind of thing. I don't know if you follow David Friedman. Yeah. He is an anarchist, but he's one of these rules without rulers guys. In other words, there are strong incentives for you to mitigate conflict by making sure that you have some kind of legal insurance, or you're part of a protective association in which that is bundled in as part of your membership dues. There can be all kinds of ways that these things can spring up. It depends on what kind of body of law you have. And I'm not prescribing anything. I've given a set of guidelines, a basic outline of the kind of things I want to see. But part of this contest, this Constitution of Consent contest, is that there are going to be all kinds of creative. Again, this goes back to the idea of creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship, that you can have legal innovations too. We want to discover these through this contest. Somebody might think of something that we've never thought of, and that could be instantiated into law. And then we build culture around that. So really quickly, Chris, and I don't mean to just blather on, but
that's what we do here.
Yeah, but you got a lot of questions, I'm sure. This idea of building culture around something, this guy who's been Balaji Srinivasan has been on the major podcast scene for a long time. You know, Tim Ferriss, I think he was on for Tim Ferriss for 4 hours, Lex Fridman for like 7 hours or something.
I can't imagine. I feel bad keeping you for over the 30 minutes I agreed to.
Oh man, no, I was expecting an hour, so this is fine.
All right,
we
good.
can stop whenever you want. But but the idea for Balaji Srinivasan is that people will gather around a moral political order in the digital cloud. And so if you and I and a whole bunch of other interesting people all around the world, and believe me, they're everywhere, can coalesce around something that is an artifact of our reverence, like the Constitution, that embodies our values. That's really the way this starts. We build a culture amongst ourselves. And in fact, I would like to see that community form and be robust. Eventually, you can start to have the ideas and the community descend down to whatever jurisdictions that it can find a toehold in. So, for example, right now in Honduras, there's the ZEDES laws. You can certain ZEDES have like patches of soil within Honduras where they have created a jurisdiction called Prospera, which is one of the freest zones the world has ever seen, and it's only existed for, I don't know, less than a decade. And they're starting to get business formation there. They're starting to get all kinds of things happening. That if you just come down to earth in one jurisdiction, this Constitution of Consent is designed to spawn subsidiary jurisdictions, but connect back up to a body of law that protects certain kinds of basic things. But the Constitution of Consent is designed very much like open source, so that you can fork it and change it to your heart's content. And certain people want to live under this body of law. And it was like, no, we absolutely have to have an abortion provision in our Constitution. So they fork it and they add the abortion prevention. And suddenly you have two constitutions of consent, one of which is with the abortion provision, one is without. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So, but the whole idea is this is a global phenomenon without being globalist, because it's not meant to instantiate any kind of centralized authority. It's precisely the opposite. It could be called a constitution of decentralization.
Yeah, I see why you invoke Jefferson. I love that you used the founders and their ideology, because I think that's just such a deep core part of American culture, American thinking, American education, that you can't really have a reformation or an evolution without talking about the founders. So I thought that part was exceptionally, but I mean, you really seem to have encapsulated in the 21st century the way that Jefferson thought about how it ought to operate, his skepticism around the Constitution. So I really appreciate that piece. I want to end with a different question, but before we move on to that final question, finish self-promoting, plugging the contest. If I enter this contest, you can win like 20 grand if you win, right? Like, so it's Absolutely. A significant contest. Where can I find details? Give me a couple other details before we move on to a different topic.
Thank you. I would encourage everybody to go to underthrow.org. It's a Substack. That's my Substack. You can sign up for free. You can also sign up to buy me a cup of coffee every month, and that is most welcome. We'll use those resources to further promote the Constitution of Consent contest and these ideas, these fairly radical ideas about how to create a social order that makes everybody as free as possible, but still united under the banner of broad liberalism, right? So underthrow.org, you come there, you'll get treated to a lot of different voices, mostly mine, but also some others people who think along these lines and in this vein. They're very libertarian informed, so they won't be disappointed if your listeners are libertarian. And you go to the nav bar and click on contest. That is that'll give you the entire contest page. You can see the rules, but also the guidelines, the kind of things that we're looking for as judges. And yeah, I would encourage everybody to think creatively about how to create a new constitution that achieves these kind of things, as well as gives you an opportunity to win $20,000. Who couldn't use that now, even though the dollar is purchasing power.
That's still a lot of money. That's still a really good amount of money. And the book is Underthrow: How Jefferson's Dangerous Ideal Will Spark a New Revolution. I'll put links to both of those things in the show notes. You're a very smart guy who seems to think differently and access very smart and bright people that are coming up with new ideas. I had not heard of like the Honduras Prosperous, right? Some of us are still woefully stuck in Politico and politicalwire.com and things like that, right? I'm interested in, having you outline your media diet. What do you read? Where do you find your books? What websites do you visit for news? If you even look at news, like if I were, we're starting Chris Spangle University and I'm hiring you to teach people how to think critically, think differently about philosophical topics and a conception of the future, where would I start? Where would you start outlining in your course?
Let's see. I read my consumption diet is often just what other people find interesting that has an interesting title and I click on it. So I have to be very, very honest in saying that's probably 50% of what I consume, and podcasts recently. I have a ton of books and things that I from the past and things that I like to read today. They make fun of me. My last name is Borders, and there used to be a Borders Books and Music, and my office is just a bunch of books, and so I'm Borders the book order. But as far as things I like to read, believe it or not, I like to read what I call dissident leftists. Okay, those are people like Matt Taibbi, Michael Schellenberger, Glenn Greenwald. Those I often start with those guys because they're doing a better job of really critiquing the authoritarian left than the libertarians are doing. I kind of get the sense that the mainstream libertarians are trying too hard to maintain this kind of neutrality, this kind of dispassionate or sort of, I don't know, detached view in what they're doing, or they try to maybe call spades with everybody without just every once in a while going, okay, these folks have a point. Whereas the dissident leftists are really, really interesting in their critiques of their own kind because they see the illiberal nature of the way the left is trending right now. And I think they're right. I also like reading really interesting right-leaning people. And right now I'm not mentioning any libertarians that I'm reading, right? So people like
just not, I was looking at that list that I kept on libertyexplained.com. Those websites aren't being updated. The organizations aren't as active. The people have kind of moved on. There's a hollowing out, I think, of kind of where the intellectual class of the libertarian movement was maybe a decade ago. And I do agree with you. I tend to like people who are criticizing their own in-group. I think that's far more interesting than somebody who is in the out-group. Like the Daily Wire constantly criticizing leftists, or the New York Times calling everything far right. Like, to me, that's not as interesting as maybe somebody who's in the tribe kind of going, I understand my people, and I think this is a problematic thing, and here's why we think that, and here's why I think, So I tend to agree with you on first the out-group, in-group criticism, and then also not a lot of libertarian stuff out there that's as not like it was, right? I don't know what it is.
There are libertarian adjacent things like Astral Star Codex, which is Scott Alexander's work, and that's a pseudonym. There is, people like even some of the sort of the dark Enlightenment people like Curtis Yarvin. Like, I checked that stuff out. I did a big critique piece of Curtis Yarvin in Quillette, but that doesn't mean that I'm not still interested in what he has to say, because he guy's freakishly smart. On the right, and also a recent convert to the right, is this guy named an English fellow who lives in Ireland, who's a deep traditionalist who is converted recently to Orthodox Christianity. He's got some really interesting ideas from the perspective of a newly converted Christian conservative. His name's Paul Kingsnorth. I like to read him. I like to read just some of the heterodox stuff like Unheard. They've got some really great writers. The Free Press, which is kind of like a centrist heterodox thing that the former opinion editor of the New York Times started, Barry Weiss. And she's also considered a dissident now because she was unwilling to toe the party line, and she wanted to have an editorial page that represented a lot of different views. And the wokies at the New York Times basically tried to run her off and essentially succeeded. But she's doing really interesting stuff now on her own terms. People like Now I just had it in my mind, and now
give me some books. Like, if there's some foundational books that like people wanted to start wading into the political philosophy that you're into. What are like 3 to 5 titles that you'd say, look, I think these were foundational, and you should definitely check them out. They stand the test of time. Okay, that's an easy one. I would do 2 Cheers for Anarchy by James C. Scott. I would do Anarchy, State, and Utopia by Robert Nozick. I would do The Social Singularity by Max Borders, obviously, because that's really a distillation of a lot of my influences and ideas. I would say the recent works of Matt Ridley. I really like Matt Ridley. I like the way he thinks about economics and technology. And I would say the Bourgeois series from Deirdre McCloskey.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Her book on liberalism I thought was excellent too. It's probably a little more of an introductory read in defending the concept of liberalism as well. I have not read the Bourgeois series, but I did like her case for liberalism.
Yeah, there's two more. I'd say The Sovereign Individual by 2 authors, Rees-Mogg, and the other author's name escapes me. And The Network State by Balaji Srinivasan, which is a recent book.
James Dale Davidson.
Yes. Thank you.
What was the last one? I'm writing these down.
The Network State by Balaji Srinivasan.
All right, cool. All right, let's end there. I thought you've been more than generous with your time. Thank you so much. Highly, highly recommend Underthrow by Max Borders. Go check out all of his books. All the titles of all your books seem really interesting, and I'll read what was the one that you mentioned? I'll read that one next. The Social Singularity.
All right. That's my most popular book, and I have to acknowledge it. For some reason, that flew off the shelves. And or the virtual shelves, because people find it at Amazon.
I own this. And okay, it's $6, and it's on Kindle Unlimited, so there's no reason not to. Come on, people.
Yeah, and then Underthrow. Yeah, I could really use the algorithmic lift on that one.
Yeah,
and if you have any listeners that are broke and want it, I'll send you the ebook for free.
Don't say that. No, don't be a freeloader. No, buy the book. Well, this audience has plenty of money, Max. Trust me. These are not poor libertarians.
Well, that's great. That's
great. So now we're not giving.
But if you've got a college kid out there who's broke, I'm happy to send them.
There
a book
we go.
As long as they rate it on Amazon.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much, Max. I really appreciate it.
Oh, likewise, Chris. It was a delight.
Thanks so much for joining me here on the Chris Spangle Show. If you got something out of this, please share it. That's the best really the only way that podcasts and content creators like Max and I can grow in what we do. That is the best way to support us. Second is throw in a couple bucks on Patreon or, his Substack, and make sure you buy his books. And it's really important to support creators that you find interesting. Thanks so much for joining us here on The Chris Spangle Show.